they didn't lower their voices. In the middle of a formal shareholder reception, David Walker smiled as he told the room that his wife no longer held any stake in the company. He said it casually, as if it were a correction, not a verdict. Laughter followed. A few phones lifted. Someone nodded, already rewriting the story in their head. Alexandra Walker stood beside him, hands still, eyes steady. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. What no one in that room understood was that the moment David sold her shares, a clause older than his confidence had already begun to move, quietly, precisely, and without mercy. Stay with this story. Some betrayals don't collapse loudly. They unwind on paper. Tell us where you're watching from and your local time. If stories about quiet strength and legal justice matter to you, consider subscribing. Alexandra Walker learned early that silence, when chosen, could be a form of record-keeping. It wasn't the silence of fear or submission. It was the kind that listened for patterns, stored details, and waited for things to repeat themselves. By the time she was 32, Alexandra had developed the habit of noticing what other people missed, not because she distrusted them, but because she understood how easily confidence could turn into carelessness. David had always mistaken that habit for passivity. They met in Boston years earlier when the company was still small enough that its offices fit on a single floor, and everyone knew where the coffee filters were kept. David was magnetic in those days. He spoke with the ease of someone who had never been told no for long. He remembered names, told stories that landed cleanly, and understood the unspoken rules of rooms that mattered. People leaned toward him without realizing it. Alexandra worked in operations then, not officially titled, not publicly credited. She built schedules that didn't collapse supplier relationships, that didn't spike costs, and internal systems that allowed the company to scale without drawing attention to the person who made it possible. She preferred it that way. When David introduced her at events, he called her brilliant, supportive, the steady one. He never lied. He simply never finished the sentence. By the time they married, Alexandra already held a minority stake in the company. It was not a romantic gesture, nor a marital concession. It had been structured years earlier when her father, Richard Hale, insisted on formalizing her involvement. Richard Hale had been precise in the way people are when they've seen enough deals fall apart to stop believing in goodwill as a safeguard. He had built his own career in quiet increments, regional manufacturing, logistics, patient capital, and he never confused trust with exposure. When Alexandra began contributing meaningfully to the company David would later help run, Richard asked for one thing: clarity on paper. The shareholder agreement had been drafted before David realized it would matter. Alexandra never waved the document around. She filed it, scanned it, labeled it, and moved on. The work mattered more. The agreement she knew would matter later, if ever. Marriage changed the optics, not the structure. David liked the way it looked when they entered rooms together. The last name helped. The photographs helped more. Over time, his introduction shifted. Alexandra became my wife before she became anything else. At first, she didn't correct him. Then she noticed she no longer needed to. People stopped asking. The company grew. Investors came and went. Lenders renewed lines. David took the stage more often. Alexandra took notes. She noticed how David skimmed documents, how he signed where tabs were placed, how he joked about lawyers while relying on them to clean up after decisions he made too quickly. She noticed how he spoke about ownership as if it were a feeling rather than a legal state. David trusted momentum. Alexandra trusted records. It was subtle at first, the way he began to refer to our shares, instead of naming percentages, the way he spoke as if control were a marital default rather than a contractual reality. Alexandra didn't interrupt. She knew that correction, when premature, often taught people to hide better. What David never asked was why Richard Hale had insisted on transfer restrictions, or why certain clauses were written with specificity that bordered on severity. He assumed those sections were legacy language drafted for risks that no longer applied. He assumed wrong. Alexandra's role within the company remained unchanged on paper, but altered in tone. Emails looped her in later. Meetings moved without her. Decisions arrived, prepackaged, presented as conclusions rather than questions. She adjusted, she adapted, she archived. When her father passed, David attended the funeral with the correct expressions and said the correct things. He never asked to review the agreement again. Alexandra didn't offer. The first sign that something had shifted came in the mail. A statement arrived late, then another, not at all. Alexandra noticed an address update she hadn't authorized. She corrected it without comment. A week later, a banking notification appeared, routine language, unfamiliar number. She saved it and went back to work. She did not confront David. She did not accuse. She waited for confirmation. David, meanwhile, had begun to feel constrained. The company was worth more now. So were his expectations. He spoke often about liquidity, about unlocking value, about how paper wealth was a kind of limitation. He framed these conversations as hypothetical, as strategic brainstorming. Alexandra listened, asked clarifying questions, and took notes she never shared. When David mentioned that some assets could be rebalanced, she asked which ones. He laughed, kissed her forehead, and said she worried too much. The truth was simpler. David believed marriage had converted complexity into permission. He believed proximity equaled access. He believed confidence could substitute for consent. Alexandra believed in sequences. She reviewed the shareholder agreement again late one evening, not because she suspected betrayal, but because she sensed inevitability. The clauses were unchanged. The language remained exact. The buyback provision sat where it always had, dormant and unassuming, like a line no one noticed until they crossed it. She closed the file and returned it to its folder. The next morning, David left early for a meeting he hadn't mentioned before. Alexandra noticed the absence of detail. She noticed, too, the ease with which he had stopped explaining. By the time she received the bank alert that confirmed the movement she had anticipated, Alexandra was not surprised. She felt something quieter than shock recognition, perhaps. The sense that a pattern had completed itself. She did not act yet. She understood timing. She understood that procedure favored patience. David would believe the transaction was finished. He would believe the story he told would replace the one written in the margins of the agreement. He would believe that silence meant ignorance. Alexandra saved the alert, labeled the file, and began to prepare not for confrontation, but for process. Because some truths did not require volume. They required sequence. And once begun, they did not stop simply because someone wished they would. Richard Hale had never trusted what people said they understood. He trusted what they signed, what they avoided, and what they never bothered to read twice. Alexandra inherited that instinct without realizing it was an inheritance at all. Growing up, she learned that her father asked fewer questions than most men. But when he did, the answers had to survive documentation. He was not cold. He was careful. There was a difference, and Alexandra understood it long before she had language for it. When she first became involved with the company, Richard watched quietly. He did not interfere. He did not offer advice. He waited until her contributions stopped being framed as help and started showing up in quarterly stability. Only then did he speak. "You should be protected," he said one evening, not as a warning, but as a statement of procedure. That was how the shareholder agreement came into being, not out of suspicion, but out of experience. Richard had seen partners drift, spouses confuse intimacy with entitlement, and businesses collapse because clarity arrived too late. He insisted on provisions that most people skimmed past: transfer restrictions, requiring explicit consent valuation formulas that favored continuity over convenience, and a buyback clause that activated under specific breaches. Alexandra read every word. David did not. At the time, David had been enthusiastic. He had been flattered by Richard's attention, reassured by the professionalism of it all. He joked about lawyers earning their fees and signed where indicated. He believed rules were scaffolding necessary during construction removable once the structure stood. He never imagined they were load-bearing. Years later, as the company expanded, Alexandra's position became increasingly quiet and increasingly essential. She managed operational risk in ways that never made headlines. Vendor disputes were resolved before they escalated. Staffing gaps closed without emergency hires. Systems scaled without costly rewrites. When problems appeared, they did so on her desk first and often died there. David took credit without malice. He genuinely believed momentum was the cause. Their marriage followed a similar pattern. Alexandra absorbed friction without comment. She kept schedules aligned, smoothed misunderstandings, and allowed David to feel unencumbered by logistics. He interpreted this as support. He never considered that it was structure. The shift began not with cruelty, but with omission. Alexandra noticed she was copied last on emails, if at all. Meetings were summarized for her instead of scheduled with her. Decisions were framed as conclusions rather than discussions. When she asked questions, David responded with reassurance instead of answers. "You trust me," he said once lightly, as if it were a reminder. Alexandra did trust him. She simply trusted documentation more. She began keeping parallel records. Not secretive, just complete. If a meeting occurred without her, she requested minutes. If a document circulated without her input, she archived the version she received and noted the date. She did not confront David about the change in behavior. She understood that people often revealed more when they believed they were unobserved. David, meanwhile, felt the pressure tightening. His lifestyle had expanded faster than his liquidity. Appearances demanded maintenance. Friends spoke about exits and windfalls, about converting paper into power. He listened. He nodded. He began to imagine solutions that felt elegant because they were invisible to scrutiny. It was around this time that Dylan Brooks re-entered his orbit. Dylan had always been persuasive in a way that stopped just short of substance. He spoke fluently about opportunity, about unlocking value, about how smart people didn't let technicalities slow them down. He framed obstacles as inefficiencies rather than safeguards. David liked the way those conversations felt. "Your wife owns shares," Dylan said one evening casually. "You're married. That's not a wall. That's a hallway." David laughed, but the idea stayed. He told himself the transaction would be temporary, strategic, that Alexandra would understand once the benefits materialized. He told himself consent was implied, that the agreement language was outdated, that nothing serious hinged on formalities no one enforced anymore. He never asked the transfer agent. Alexandra sensed the acceleration before she saw evidence of it. David's confidence sharpened into something brittle. He spoke faster. He explained less. He began making plans that assumed outcomes instead of preparing for them. She reviewed the agreement again, not to reassure herself, but to confirm her memory. The buyback clause was clear. It did not threaten. It did not moralize. It simply stated that unauthorized transfers triggered mandatory repurchase at a predefined valuation with costs assigned to the breaching party. It was not punitive. It was corrective. Alexandra closed the file and placed it back where it belonged. The bank alert arrived 2 weeks later. The language was neutral. Funds transferred, account updated. Alexandra recognized the routing number immediately. She did not open the message right away. She finished what she was doing, saved her work, and then read it carefully twice. There was no confusion. The transaction had occurred. She checked the date. She checked the amount. She cross-referenced the timing with David's unexplained meeting. Everything aligned. Alexandra did not cry. She did not feel anger in the way movies described it. What she felt was a tightening clarity, like the final piece of a pattern settling into place. She printed the alert and filed it. Then she logged into the company's internal system and reviewed the most recent cap table update. There, it was a discrepancy small enough to miss, large enough to matter. She made a note. David came home that evening buoyant. He spoke about future plans, about opportunities opening up. He kissed her cheek and asked about her day. Alexandra answered honestly and without detail. She did not ask about his meeting. He slept easily. Alexandra did not. Not because she was distressed, but because she was planning. She understood that the next steps mattered more than the last ones. That premature confrontation would only prompt narrative management. That silence maintained a little longer would allow the paper trail to complete itself. She began compiling emails, alerts, dates. She created a timeline without commentary, without accusation, just sequence. Somewhere in that sequence, the buyback clause began to breathe, not as a threat, but as a process. It did not require her emotion. It did not require her permission. It required only that the conditions be met. They had been. Alexandra closed her laptop just before dawn. The house was quiet. David slept unaware, confident that what he had done was clever, efficient, and visible. Alexandra knew better. Not because she was smarter, but because she had read the ending before the story began. David's confidence did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. It came from small successes that went unchallenged, decisions made quickly, questions deflected with charm, documents signed without resistance. Over time, he learned which pauses meant permission and which silences meant nothing at all. Alexandra's silence, he decided, meant the latter. The pressure he felt was not the kind that announced itself. It did not come as a crisis or a deadline. It came as comparison. Friends who spoke about exits over drinks. Couples who moved money with the ease of people who had never been asked to justify it. Invitations that implied expectations. He began to feel constrained, not by lack of opportunity, but by process. Liquidity, he told himself, was not greed. It was flexibility. Dylan Brooks reinforced the idea with practiced ease. They met at a private club downtown, one of those places where the lighting softened faces and the conversations were designed to feel confidential. Dylan spoke about structures, about workarounds that were technically clean, even if they weren't formally celebrated. He framed the shareholder agreement as conservative, outdated, overly cautious. No one enforces those things unless someone complains, Dylan said, stirring his drink. And why would your wife complain? You're married. David nodded. The logic felt sound because it felt familiar. He had grown used to spaces where access replaced consent. He had learned that proximity often blurred boundaries enough to make them disappear. He told himself Alexandra would understand, that the sale was temporary, that the benefits would outweigh the discomfort. He told himself that the agreement language was boilerplate drafted for hypothetical risks that never materialized in real life. He never asked why the buyback clause existed. The mechanics unfolded quickly. A buyer was identified, an investment entity that specialized in quiet acquisitions, more interested in returns than governance. The paperwork moved through intermediaries who asked fewer questions than they should have. Signatures were rotated digitally. Approvals were implied. David felt a thrill, as the transaction neared completion. Not because he was doing something wrong, but because he believed he was finally acting decisively. He imagined Alexandra's relief when the capital freed up options. He imagined gratitude replacing hesitation. What he did not imagine was resistance. Alexandra noticed the changes before the confirmation arrived. Mail that once came regularly began arriving late. A notice from the transfer agent appeared with a formatting inconsistency minor but unfamiliar. She corrected an address update she hadn't requested and logged the change. When the same update reappeared days later, she took a screenshot. She did not confront David. She did not even mention it. She understood that confrontation would only teach him where to hide the next step. Instead, she observed. She noted how David stopped mentioning certain meetings, how he framed upcoming weeks as busy without details, how he began to speak in outcomes rather than processes. She recognized the pattern. It was the same one she had seen in vendors who cut corners and executives who rushed forecasts. Confidence before confirmation. The bank alert arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Alexandra was in the middle of reviewing operational metrics when the notification appeared neutral language standard formatting unfamiliar reference number. She did not open it immediately. She finished her review, saved her notes, and then read the alert carefully. Funds transferred. Account updated. She read it again. The routing number matched the one she had seen on a prior unrelated document months earlier. She cross-referenced it with her records. The timing aligned with David's unexplained meeting. The amount matched the valuation Dylan had once mentioned casually, as if in passing. There was no ambiguity left. Alexandra printed the alert and placed it in a folder labeled by date, not by emotion. She logged into the company's internal system and reviewed the most recent cap table update. The discrepancy was subtle, a shift small enough to evade casual notice, large enough to trigger downstream consequences. She took a screenshot. David came home that evening, energized. He spoke about future plans with an ease that bordered on optimism. He talked about travel, about restructuring, about how things were finally moving. He did not mention the transaction. He did not ask Alexandra if she had noticed anything unusual. She listened. She nodded. She asked neutral questions that invited explanation without suspicion. David filled the silence with confidence. That night, Alexandra reviewed the shareholder agreement again. Not to reassure herself, she no longer needed that, but to confirm the sequence. The transfer restrictions were explicit. Consent requirements were clear. The buyback clause sat precisely where it always had dormant, until activated by unauthorized movement. The clause did not require intent. It did not require malice. It required only action. David had acted. Alexandra closed the document and placed it back in its folder. She did not feel triumph. She felt responsibility. She understood that the agreement would do what it was designed to do, but only if the process was respected. Premature action could complicate matters. Silence maintained a little longer would allow the paper trail to mature. The next morning, David left early again. Alexandra noticed the absence of explanation. She noticed, too, the ease with which he had stopped accounting for his movements. It confirmed what she already knew. He believed the matter was settled. She began compiling evidence methodically. Emails that referenced valuation without context. Calendar entries that aligned with transactional timing. Voicemail messages that revealed more than David intended. She labeled everything by date and source, resisting the urge to interpret. Facts first. Meaning later. She reached out to no one yet. Not the board. Not the transfer agent. Not legal counsel. She understood that the first move mattered less than the last one. That the power of the clause lay not in its existence, but in its execution. David, meanwhile, began to behave as if ownership were a settled question. He spoke more freely about decisions. He made assumptions about authority. He corrected people who deferred to Alexandra gently at first, then publicly. "She's not involved in that anymore," he said once, smiling as if clarifying a misunderstanding. Alexandra said nothing. What David did not understand was that the transaction he believed had freed him had in fact bound him, that the agreement he dismissed as outdated had been waiting for precisely this sequence, that the silence he mistook for ignorance was in reality preparation. Alexandra closed her laptop one evening and looked around the house they shared. The familiarity felt different now, not hostile, but temporary. She understood that some structures only revealed their limits when tested. David slept easily. He dreamed of expansion of options unlocked, of momentum regained. Alexandra reviewed her notes one last time before bed. The sequence was complete. The evidence was clean. The next steps would require precision, not emotion. The clause had been triggered. It did not announce itself. It did not hurry. It simply waited for the moment when procedure would speak louder than confidence ever could. The transaction settled on a Thursday. Not ceremonially, not with signatures spread across a table or champagne poured over congratulations. It settled the way most unauthorized things did, through automated confirmations, neutral language, and the quiet confidence of systems, assuming that someone else had checked what mattered. David received the confirmation first. He read it quickly, scanning for the line that mattered most: funds received. He didn't linger on the rest. The disclaimers, the conditional language, the references to compliance, review those, were boilerplate. They always were. What mattered was that the money had moved, and no one had stopped it. He forwarded the email to Dylan, with a single line done. Dylan responded with enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. "Told you. Clean and quiet. That's how it's supposed to be." David believed him because he wanted to. The sense of relief that followed surprised even him. It felt like breathing after holding his lungs tight for too long. The pressure eased. The future felt negotiable again. Alexandra learned about the settlement the same way she had learned about the initiation, indirectly. A secondary bank alert arrived that afternoon, distinct from the first. It referenced final settlement language and included an attachment she had never seen before. She opened it slowly, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to read it the way she read everything else, with attention. The attachment confirmed what she already knew. The buyer had taken possession of the shares under the assumption of valid authority. The funds had cleared. The transaction had in every practical sense completed. Alexandra saved the file and added it to the growing folder on her desktop. She labeled it by date, then by category: settlement, unauthorized transfer, evidence. She did not feel urgency. If anything, the completion clarified the path forward. In many agreements, incomplete actions left room for argument. Completed ones triggered consequences. She logged into the company's internal system again and reviewed the cap table update that had been quietly pushed through earlier that day. The numbers now aligned with the settlement. The discrepancy was no longer subtle. It was structural. She took another screenshot. Marcus Reed noticed it too. He was the kind of CFO who trusted systems until they gave him a reason not to. When they did, he didn't panic. He reconciled. That afternoon, he sent Alexandra a brief message, carefully worded. "Do you have a moment to discuss a cap table update? Something doesn't match prior approvals." Alexandra replied that she did. They scheduled a call for the next morning. David spent the evening planning. He spoke about reallocating resources, about accelerating a project that had stalled under budget scrutiny. He framed it all as progress. Alexandra listened without interrupting. She noted how he used plural pronouns. We decided we're moving forward without checking whether she agreed. He assumed agreement. He had assumed it before. That night, Alexandra reviewed the shareholder agreement once more, this time alongside the settlement documents. She wasn't looking for validation. She was looking for alignment. Dates matched. Conditions were satisfied. The unauthorized transfer had occurred. The buyback clause, dormant for years, was now active. It did not require notice to David to become so. It required only verification. The clause specified timelines, valuation methodology, cost allocation. It did not mention intent. It did not offer discretion. It did not care whether David believed he had done the right thing. It cared only that he had done it. Alexandra closed the file and opened a new document. She began outlining next steps, not actions, but sequence. Who needed to be notified and when? Which parties required formal notice? Which evidence would be included and which would be held in reserve? She did not include David's name in the document. Not yet. The call with Marcus the next morning was brief and professional. He described the discrepancy without accusation. He asked whether there had been a board approval he might have missed. Alexandra told him there had not. She did not elaborate. She did not speculate. She thanked him for noticing and asked him to preserve all related records. Marcus understood the tone. He agreed without hesitation. After the call, Alexandra forwarded him a copy of the shareholder agreement, only the relevant sections. She highlighted nothing. She trusted him to read. David, meanwhile, began to enjoy the sense of authority the transaction gave him. He corrected people more often. He spoke with finality. When a senior manager deferred to Alexandra during a meeting, David smiled and said, "That's no longer necessary." Alexandra did not react. She wrote it down. The buyer reached out that afternoon not to Alexandra, but to David. They wanted assurances, routine ones, framed as follow-ups. David responded confidently. He referenced marital consent as a given. He did not copy Alexandra. She saw the email anyway. It had been forwarded by mistake or perhaps by assumption. She read it once, then again. She saved it. That message mattered. It demonstrated reliance on an assumption rather than documentation. It showed that David had represented authority he did not possess. She added it to the folder. The sense of inevitability settled in fully that evening. Not dread, not satisfaction, just clarity. Alexandra understood that the hardest part of what was coming would not be the legal procedure. It would be the emotional distance required to let it proceed without interference. She did not want to punish David. She wanted the structure to correct itself. David mistook her calm for acceptance. He spoke openly now about the company's future, as if the matter of ownership had resolved itself permanently. He hinted at changes at people who might not fit the new direction. He said these things casually, as if testing how far his authority extended. Alexandra did not test it back. Instead, she finalized her documentation. She ensured timestamps were preserved. She verified audio quality on the voicemail she had saved weeks earlier, a message David had left Dylan confident enough to speak plainly. It confirmed what the email suggested. She did not share it yet. The buyback clause allowed for a brief window before formal notice. It existed to give parties time to reconcile, to correct errors if they wished. Alexandra respected that window. She let it close naturally. By the end of the week, the file was complete. David believed the story he had begun telling publicly, that Alexandra's role had diminished, that ownership had shifted, that control had consolidated. He believed that silence meant acquiescence. He believed that confidence could carry him through the next phase. He did not believe in the weight of what he had signed years earlier under fluorescent lights without reading twice. Alexandra believed in sequence. She closed the folder, backed it up in 2 places, and drafted a short email to herself, dated and time-stamped. It contained no accusations. It contained no emotion. It contained only the facts. The next steps would require legal counsel. They would require timing. They would require patience. But the most important threshold had already been crossed. The shares had been sold. The clause had been triggered. And the story David thought he controlled was no longer his to tell. Alexandra waited 3 days before calling Margaret Lewis. Not because she doubted the need for counsel, but because she understood the difference between urgency and readiness. By the time she picked up the phone, the file was complete. Dates aligned. Records were preserved. The sequence could speak for itself. Margaret answered on the second ring. Her voice was even practiced, free of curiosity. She did not ask why Alexandra was calling. She asked when she could review the documents. They met the following morning in Margaret's office, a space defined less by decor than by order. The desk was clear. The shelves were labeled. Nothing was accidental. Alexandra placed the folder down between them. She did not narrate. She did not editorialize. She opened it to the first page and slid it forward. Margaret read without interruption. She moved slowly, not because the material was complex, but because she understood that precision mattered more than speed. She checked dates against timestamps, cross-referenced email headers, reviewed the bank alerts, and paused at the settlement confirmation. When she reached the shareholder agreement, she read that more carefully than anything else. The buyback clause did not surprise her. "This is clean," Margaret said at last, not as praise, but as assessment. "Unauthorized transfer. No consent. Completed transaction. The clause is active." Alexandra nodded. She had not come for validation. Margaret continued. "The agreement doesn't require intent. It doesn't require notification prior to activation. It requires proof. You have that." Alexandra asked a single question. "What happens if I act too soon?" Margaret considered it. "Then he learns where the edges are before the structure finishes settling. That invites narrative management. Delay favors procedure." Alexandra agreed. That had been her instinct as well. They discussed next steps in terms that avoided drama. Notice requirements, compliance triggers, parties who would need to be informed, and parties who should not be yet. Margaret outlined options, not recommendations. Alexandra listened. "There's also the matter of personal exposure," Margaret added, flipping back to a page Alexandra had flagged. "Your husband signed personal guarantees tied to ownership covenants. If those covenants are breached, and they are, his exposure is not limited to the company." Alexandra did not react. She had already seen the language. She had already understood the implication. Hearing it aloud did not change the math. "What I don't want," Alexandra said, "is a spectacle." Margaret looked up. "Then we proceed by process. No announcements, no accusations. We let the mechanisms do what they were designed to do." Alexandra left the office with no visible change in posture. If anything, she looked lighter, not relieved, but unburdened. The next phase would be procedural. She trusted procedure. David sensed the shift without recognizing it. He noticed that Alexandra stopped asking questions altogether. Not clarifying ones, not neutral ones. She simply listened. He interpreted this as acceptance. He spoke more freely, filling the space she left with confidence. He began making decisions unilaterally. He revised agendas. He reassigned responsibilities. When someone hesitated, he smiled and said, "That's already been handled." Alexandra recorded these moments privately, not as grievances, but as context. Authority asserted without basis had a way of becoming relevant later. She did not confront him at home. She did not argue about tone or credit. She did not ask for explanations. She maintained routine. Meals were eaten. Schedules were kept. The absence of friction allowed David to relax further into assumption. That assumption would matter. Margaret began preparing drafts, none of which were sent. Notices were outlined, not issued. Emails were composed, then saved. Each document was time-stamped and stored ready to be deployed when the sequence required it. Alexandra reviewed each draft carefully. She corrected language that implied emotion. She removed adjectives that could be interpreted as judgment. She insisted on clarity without commentary. Facts only, she said. Margaret complied. The next development came from the buyer. They requested a meeting informal exploratory. They wanted to discuss governance expectations, future cooperation. David accepted without hesitation. He did not include Alexandra in the invitation. The meeting occurred on a Wednesday afternoon. Alexandra learned of it afterward through a forwarded calendar summary sent by an assistant who assumed she should be informed. The summary included notes David had not intended her to see. Assurances given, authority affirmed, no concerns raised. Alexandra read the summary twice and saved it. It confirmed reliance. It confirmed representation. It confirmed that the buyer believed the transfer had been valid and final. That belief would soon be tested. Marcus Reed called that evening. He was careful, but the concern was no longer subtle. "I've reviewed the agreement," he said. "If this transfer stands, we have a compliance issue with our lenders." Alexandra acknowledged it. She told him Margaret Lewis was reviewing next steps. She asked him to preserve records and make no changes without written authorization. Marcus understood the implication. He agreed. David, meanwhile, began to behave as if the matter were settled beyond question. He corrected a board member during a call asserting authority he believed he now possessed. He began speaking publicly about new ownership alignment, careful not to mention Alexandra by name. She watched the recordings later. She did not flinch. At home, David's tone shifted. He spoke less like a partner and more like a manager. He explained decisions rather than discussing them. He framed changes as necessary, inevitable. Alexandra let him speak. She understood something David did not, that control asserted without legitimacy often accelerated its own exposure. The more he claimed authority, the more evidence accumulated that he lacked it. Margaret finalized the notice package by the end of the week. It was precise. It was unemotional. It referenced only facts and clauses. It made no demands beyond those already written into the agreement years earlier. Alexandra reviewed it once, then twice. She did not request changes. "Timing?" Margaret asked. "Not yet," Alexandra said. "There's one more piece." That piece arrived in the form of a voicemail David left Dylan late one night, confident and careless. He spoke plainly, assuming privacy where none existed. He referenced the transfer, the lack of consent, the assumption that marriage covered the gap. Alexandra transcribed the message, word for word. She verified the metadata. She added it to the file. When she closed the folder that evening, the sequence was complete. David slept unaware of the weight accumulating quietly around him. He believed the hardest part was over. He believed the transaction had freed him. Alexandra believed in thresholds. She understood that once crossed, they did not reverse. That procedure, once initiated, moved forward without regard for confidence or regret. That the agreement had been written for this moment, not in anger, but in foresight. The buyback clause waited patiently. The notices sat drafted and unsent. The record stood complete. Alexandra did not rush. She knew exactly when to let the process begin. Alexandra understood that evidence did not need to be dramatic to be decisive. It needed only to be intact. She began the final phase of preparation quietly, at the margins of David's confidence. While he spoke openly about alignment and authority, she worked through records that required patience rather than confrontation. Every file she touched was duplicated, time-stamped, and preserved in its original format. Nothing was edited. Nothing was highlighted for effect. She trusted that accuracy would carry its own weight. Emails were first. She traced their paths through headers and forwarding rules, confirming when addresses had been altered and by whom. She identified the moment David had rerouted notices meant for her not maliciously at first, but conveniently. Later, the rerouting became deliberate. The timestamps told that story without commentary. Next came the bank records. Alexandra requested certified statements through channels David did not monitor. She matched settlement amounts to internal projections Dylan had once described casually months earlier. The numbers aligned with unsettling precision. She noted the correspondence and moved on. Audio was last. The voicemail David had left Dylan was brief and unguarded. He spoke as if explaining a clever solution, not confessing to a breach. He mentioned the agreement dismissively, called it technical, assumed no one would care. Alexandra listened once to confirm clarity. She did not listen again. She transcribed the message verbatim, preserving tone and cadence. She verified the metadata twice. Then she saved the original file untouched and placed the transcript beside it. Marcus Reed remained careful, but increasingly uneasy. He began asking questions that were framed as procedural rather than personal. Alexandra responded with equal restraint. She did not instruct him to act. She instructed him to wait. The waiting mattered. David continued to overreach. At a midweek staff meeting, he announced changes to reporting lines that bypassed Alexandra entirely. When someone hesitated, he smiled and said, "This is already approved." The room accepted the explanation without challenge. Alexandra noted the moment and the date. Later, during a call with external partners, David referred to Alexandra as no longer operationally involved. He said it lightly, as if clarifying a detail. No one corrected him. Alexandra did not either. She understood that false statements made publicly had a way of becoming useful later, not as insults, but as admissions. The more David asserted a reality that did not exist, the more visible the gap became between narrative and record. Margaret Lewis checked in briefly, not to push, but to confirm readiness. Alexandra told her the file was complete. Margaret asked if Alexandra wanted to proceed. "Soon," Alexandra said. "Not yet." There was a board meeting scheduled for the following week. Routine on the surface, quarterly review, lender updates, strategic planning. David had positioned it as a formality. Alexandra recognized it as a convergence point. She did not request to be added to the agenda. Instead, she reviewed the meeting logistics. Who would attend? Who would dial in? Which departments would provide reports? She cross-referenced the list with the notice distribution Margaret had prepared. The alignment was precise. David began speaking more openly at home about what he believed would happen next. He talked about simplifying ownership, about how things would run smoother now. He framed the changes as inevitable progress. Alexandra listened without responding. Her calm allowed him to assume agreement. That assumption extended into other areas. He stopped asking where she was going. He stopped explaining his schedule. He began behaving as if accountability had shifted permanently. Alexandra adjusted her routine subtly. She changed passwords on personal devices. She updated backups. She forwarded nothing to shared accounts. She did not announce these changes. She did not explain them. The night before the board meeting, David rehearsed talking points aloud, pacing the living room, with the ease of someone accustomed to being affirmed. He spoke about alignment, about confidence from lenders, about how ownership clarity had reassured investors. Alexandra sat at the table with a notebook open. She wrote nothing. David glanced at her once, then continued. He believed her silence was disinterest. He believed any room would respond the way it always had. The board meeting began on schedule. Alexandra attended remotely, her camera on, but her microphone muted. She did not announce herself. She watched. David spoke first confidently. He summarized progress. He referenced the transaction without naming it directly. He implied stability. He implied authority. When questions arose, he answered quickly. He did not consult anyone. He did not defer. He spoke as if the answers were settled. Marcus presented the financials. His tone was careful. He flagged a compliance consideration without elaboration. David brushed it aside with a smile. "We're aligned," he said. "Ownership issues have been resolved." Alexandra wrote down the exact wording. The meeting moved on. No notices were sent that day. No emails followed. David ended the call satisfied. He believed he had closed the loop. Alexandra did not act immediately. She waited until the meeting recording was uploaded. She downloaded it. She saved it in its original format. She noted the timestamp of David's statement. That statement mattered. Margaret reviewed the updated file the next morning. She listened to the voicemail. She watched the meeting clip. She reviewed the emails and bank records. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at Alexandra. "This is more than sufficient," she said. Alexandra nodded. "Then we proceed." They discussed timing in minutes, not days. The notices would be sent simultaneously. The distribution list would include the board, the transfer agent, lender compliance, and the buyer. No advance warning, no staggered release. A scheduled email would handle it. Alexandra reviewed the final draft once more. She removed a single phrase that could be interpreted as accusatory. She replaced it with a reference to a clause number. She approved the schedule. The email was set to send 48 hours later. David remained unaware. He spent the next day planning announcements, drafting internal messages that assumed outcomes not yet realized. He spoke confidently about restructuring. He referenced future meetings that would never occur. Alexandra watched without intervening. She understood that anticipation had a cost, that the more David committed himself to a narrative, the harder the correction would land. She did not need to humiliate him. She needed only to allow reality to assert itself. The night before the scheduled email, Alexandra slept soundly. The file was complete. The process was prepared. There was nothing left to add. David slept confidently. He believed the story was his. He did not know that it had already been written years earlier, in clauses he never read twice, in agreements he dismissed as formalities, in records that now waited patiently for a single moment. When the email sent, it would not accuse. It would not argue. It would simply arrive. The event had been framed as routine. A quarterly review folded into a lender update, followed by a reception meant to signal stability. David liked the optics. He liked how predictability calmed rooms and how calm rooms deferred to whoever spoke first. He arrived early, greeted people by name, and accepted congratulations for progress that had not yet been measured. Alexandra arrived on time. She wore nothing that suggested confrontation, no sharp lines, no colors that demanded attention. She chose familiarity. She chose neutrality. Her posture was composed, her expression unreadable, in the way that discouraged questions without inviting concern. David noticed her presence and felt a flicker of irritation, not because she was there, but because she appeared comfortable. He had expected distance. He had expected uncertainty. He offered a polite nod and turned back to the people who mattered. The meeting unfolded as planned. David spoke with authority, summarizing outcomes as if they were settled facts. He referenced alignment, reassured lenders, and used language that suggested consensus without naming participants. When questions arose, he answered them decisively, occasionally glancing at Alexandra as if to confirm her irrelevance. She did not respond. Marcus presented financials with precision. He flagged compliance considerations using language that was accurate but restrained. David smiled through it, reframing concerns as transitional noise. The room accepted the explanation. Alexandra watched faces, not slides. She noted who leaned back, who frowned briefly, who stopped taking notes. She observed how confidence filled gaps where clarity should have been. She understood how easily rooms followed tone over substance. When the meeting adjourned, the reception began immediately. Drinks were poured, conversations loosened. David moved easily between clusters, reinforcing the story he had already told. He spoke about the future as if it were already scheduled. At one point, a junior associate congratulated Alexandra quietly. "It must be a relief," she said, glancing toward David. "All that ownership complexity behind you." Alexandra smiled faintly. She did not correct her. David overheard a fragment of the exchange and approached, glass in hand. "Alexandra's focusing on other things now," he said smoothly, placing himself between her and the associate. "We've streamlined." The associate nodded, embarrassed. Alexandra said nothing. David's tone sharpened as the evening progressed. He corrected people more often. He clarified roles that had not changed. He spoke about authority as if naming it made it real. The confidence drew attention. It also drew witnesses. Phones lifted occasionally, casually. Someone recorded a short clip of David speaking animatedly about clean ownership lines. Alexandra noticed. She did not intervene. The scheduled email sat quietly in a server queue, time-stamped and addressed. Margaret had triple-checked the distribution list. Alexandra had approved it without comment. The email would send the following morning. David believed the reception marked closure. He spoke with finality. He told a lender that any remaining concerns were already handled. He laughed easily. He looked relieved. Alexandra remained present without participating. She stood where she could see exits, not stages. She listened more than she spoke. She wrote nothing down. Late in the evening, David raised his glass and addressed a small group nearby. He spoke about partnership, about trust, about how clarity allowed leadership to function. He did not mention Alexandra by name. She met his eyes briefly. There was no anger there. There was no warning either. The next morning, Alexandra woke early and reviewed the file one last time. She checked timestamps. She verified attachments. She confirmed that the audio file remained unaltered. She opened the draft email and read it from beginning to end. It contained no adjectives. It named no motives. It referenced clauses, dates, and attachments. It requested acknowledgement, not agreement. She closed the document. The email sent at precisely 9 a.m. David was mid-conversation when his phone vibrated. He glanced at it without concern. Notifications were constant. He returned to his meeting. The second vibration came less than a minute later. Then a third. He excused himself and stepped into the hallway, already irritated. He opened the email. The subject line was neutral. The sender was Margaret Lewis. David read the first paragraph quickly, then stopped. He read it again, slower this time. His breath caught somewhere between sentences. Unauthorized transfer. Clause activated. Mandatory repurchase. Personal exposure. His phone vibrated again. A text from Dylan, fragmented and urgent. Another from a board member asking to talk. Then a missed call from the transfer agent. David's confidence fractured silently. He scrolled through the email, seeing attachments he did not recognize but understood immediately. Bank records, email headers, a voicemail transcript. The language was calm. The implications were not. He called Alexandra. She did not answer. Inside the conference room, conversation stalled as phones began to light up. The board received the same email. Lender compliance flagged the covenant breach automatically. The buyer forwarded the notice to their legal team within minutes. Marcus sent Alexandra a brief message. Received. Understood. David returned to the room, visibly altered. He attempted to resume the meeting, but the tone had shifted. Questions were no longer hypothetical. They were procedural. What exactly does this mean? Someone asked. David opened his mouth and closed it again. He had no answer that fit the room. Alexandra spoke for the first time that morning. The agreement outlines the process, she said evenly. Counsel has provided the documentation. She said nothing else. The room fell quiet, not in shock, but in recalibration. People began rereading. They checked attachments. They recognized the precision of the language and the completeness of the record. David attempted to regain footing. He suggested misunderstandings, timing issues, assumptions that could be clarified. The words sounded thin against the paper trail now circulating. No one argued with him. They didn't need to. By the time the meeting adjourned, the story had changed. Not because Alexandra told it differently, but because the record did. David left the building alone. Alexandra remained behind, briefly answering procedural questions without elaboration. She did not celebrate. She did not console. She respected the process as it unfolded. Outside, the city moved on as it always did. Traffic flowed, emails sent, meetings continued. But inside the structure, David believed he controlled the sequence, had completed itself. The email had arrived. The clause had spoken. And confidence at last had yielded to record. The fallout did not explode. It reorganized. Within minutes of the email's delivery, systems began responding in ways that did not require permission. Lender compliance flags triggered automatically, routing alerts through channels David had never bothered to map. The transfer agent acknowledged receipt and placed a temporary hold on the disputed shares pending review. The buyer's legal counsel requested clarification, their language shifting from confident to cautious in the space of a paragraph. David experienced it as noise, at first alert stacking calls cueing the sense that something administrative had gone wrong. He told himself it was fixable. He told himself that misunderstandings happened. He told himself that lawyers exaggerated risk for leverage. He called Margaret Lewis. She did not take the call. He called Dylan next. The line connected, then dropped. When Dylan finally answered, his tone was stripped of enthusiasm. He spoke quickly, defensively, already reframing the situation as a misunderstanding that David had assured him was covered. "You said your wife was on board," Dylan said. "You said consent was implied." David hung up without responding. Inside the building, Alexandra met briefly with Marcus and two board members who had requested clarification. She did not bring the full file. She did not need to. The email had done its work. She explained the process, not the dispute. She referenced the agreement, not David's behavior. She described the next steps in neutral terms: review, acknowledgement, execution. She did not speculate on outcomes. Her tone was steady. It reassured without persuading. One board member asked whether Alexandra intended to pursue damages beyond the buyback. She paused before answering. "The agreement outlines remedies," she said. "I intend to follow it." That answer settled the question. David's attempt to control the narrative unraveled further that afternoon when the buyer requested a formal call, this time with counsel present. David joined late, unprepared. The buyer's attorney spoke first carefully. "Our client relied on representations of authority," she said. "We need to understand the scope of exposure." David began explaining, gesturing even though no one could see him. He spoke about marriage, about shared assets, about how these things were commonly understood. The attorney listened without interruption. "Do you have written consent?" she asked when he finished. David hesitated. Alexandra was silent on the line. "No," David said finally. But the attorney cut in politely. "Then our client will need to evaluate remedies. We will revert in writing." The call ended. David felt something collapse internally, not fear exactly, but the realization that words no longer moved the room. The authority he had relied on was gone, replaced by a procedural gravity he could not negotiate with charm. By evening, his personal bank contacted him, not to accuse, but to notify. Certain accounts were under review due to potential covenant exposure. Access was not revoked yet, but restrictions were imminent, pending clarification. He drove home in silence. Alexandra arrived later. She did not mention the day. She did not ask how he was. She prepared dinner as usual, ate quietly, and reviewed notes after he went to bed. She did not sleep much, not from anxiety, but from attentiveness. The next phase would require responsiveness. She remained available. The formal responses began arriving the following morning. The transfer agent confirmed the hold. The lender requested documentation. The board scheduled an emergency session to review governance implications. Each message echoed the same refrain: procedure required acknowledgement. Margaret Lewis coordinated the responses. She sent what was necessary and nothing more. She declined requests for commentary. She provided records, not explanations. David attempted to interject himself into the process. He emailed board members individually suggesting urgency, proposing calls. Most did not respond. Those who did deferred to counsel. At noon, he received the first written notice outlining the buyback calculation. The numbers were stark. The valuation formula designed to deter precisely this kind of unauthorized transfer set the repurchase price at a level that absorbed liquidity rather than generating it. Fees compounded. Costs shifted. Personal guarantees activated. David read the notice twice. The math did not change. He forwarded it to Alexandra with a single line: "We need to talk." She did not respond immediately. When she did hours later, her message was brief. "Counsel has outlined the process. Please coordinate through them." The distance was procedural, not emotional. It was absolute. The board met that afternoon without David present. Alexandra attended remotely, answering questions about continuity and operations. She reassured them that staff would be protected, that projects would proceed, that no public statements were required. "We will remain focused," she said. "The agreement is handling the rest." By the end of the day, the narrative had shifted completely. Not because Alexandra corrected it, but because systems recalibrated around documented reality. David's authority had not been challenged. It had been redefined. The buyer sent a formal notice of intent to pursue remedies against David personally for misrepresentation. Dylan stopped returning calls altogether. At home, the silence thickened. David moved through rooms, as if uncertain of their boundaries. He attempted conversation, once then stopped. Alexandra maintained routine without hostility. She did not explain. She did not justify. She allowed the consequences to remain external, administered by structures David could not influence. The next morning, a courier delivered a packet addressed to David. He recognized the sender immediately: his bank. He did not open it until Alexandra left for work. Inside were notices of review potential acceleration and a request for immediate disclosure of contingent liabilities. He sat at the table reading until the words blurred. Alexandra spent the day stabilizing what mattered. She met with department heads, clarified reporting lines, reassured vendors. She did not mention David. She did not need to. The organization adjusted, naturally drawn toward clarity. By evening, David understood something he had not considered before, that the agreement had not been designed to hurt him. It had been designed to protect the company from him. That distinction mattered too late. Alexandra returned home to find him waiting, papers spread across the table. He looked up as she entered. "We need to talk," he said again, this time without certainty. Alexandra set her bag down and sat opposite him. She did not touch the papers. "The process is underway," she said calmly. "I won't interfere with it." David searched her face for emotion, for anger, satisfaction, anything that could be argued with. He found none. "You knew," he said quietly. "Yes," Alexandra replied. "I read." That was all she offered. The rest would be handled elsewhere, by clauses, by calculations, by procedures written long before either of them imagined this ending. The story David thought he controlled had moved beyond him. And it was not finished yet. The emergency board session was scheduled for Friday morning. David learned about it the same way he had learned about most things recently, after the decision had already been made. The calendar invite arrived without commentary, without the courtesy of explanation. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, as if the wording might change if he waited. It did not. Alexandra received the same invitation. She accepted within minutes. The difference between them was not urgency. It was orientation. Alexandra treated the meeting as a continuation of process. David treated it as a last opportunity to recover control. He arrived early and waited in the corridor outside the conference room, pacing. He rehearsed explanations in his head, testing tones, discarding phrases that sounded defensive. He told himself that boards respected confidence, that mistakes could be reframed as misunderstandings if addressed decisively enough. When Alexandra arrived, she did not acknowledge his presence immediately. She greeted the general counsel, nodded to Marcus, and took a seat at the far end of the table. Her posture was neutral. She carried no documents. Everything she needed was already in the room. David sat opposite her. The meeting began without ceremony. The chair opened by summarizing the facts as they were now understood: an unauthorized transfer, a triggered buyback clause, lender compliance concerns, and potential exposure for the company if governance clarity was not restored quickly. Each point was stated plainly. No names were raised yet. David waited for his moment. When it came, he spoke quickly, trying to shape the narrative before it settled. He described his intent as protective strategic. He emphasized marital partnership. He suggested the agreement had not anticipated their circumstances. He implied that Alexandra had been informed, if not formally consulted. Alexandra listened without interrupting. When he finished, the chair turned to her. "Alexandra," he said, "do you wish to respond?" She paused, not for effect, but to consider what needed to be said and what did not. "The documentation speaks for itself," she said evenly. "The agreement outlines consent requirements. Those were not met. The transfer completed regardless. The clause activated accordingly." She did not mention David's intent. She did not characterize his actions. She did not appeal to fairness or emotion. She returned to silence. A board member asked about continuity. Another asked whether Alexandra intended to exercise the buyback immediately or explore alternatives. Alexandra answered only what was asked. "The agreement specifies timing. I intend to follow it." The general counsel then reviewed the legal position in greater detail, referencing the materials Margaret had provided. He did not editorialize. He confirmed that the board's role was to ensure compliance, not mediate personal disputes. David attempted to interject. He spoke about negotiation, about flexibility, about how damage could be mitigated if handled internally. The general counsel acknowledged the comment and moved on. By the time the meeting adjourned, there was no ambiguity left about direction. The board issued a short internal memo that afternoon. It stated that governance would proceed under existing agreements and that all inquiries should be routed through council. No public statement would be made. No internal speculation would be encouraged. The memo did not mention David by name. That omission was deliberate. David left the building feeling smaller than he had ever felt there. The corridors seemed longer. The familiar faces avoided his eyes, not out of hostility, but out of uncertainty. Authority had not been stripped from him theatrically. It had simply stopped responding. Alexandra returned to work. She spent the afternoon with department heads, not to announce changes, but to answer questions. She emphasized stability. She reminded them that their work continued, that nothing in the day-to-day operations had shifted. "The company is protected," she said more than once. That was the point of the structure. The buyback notice arrived that evening, formal and final. Margaret forwarded it with a single line. "This initiates the next phase." David read the notice in his car parked outside the house he no longer felt anchored to. The calculation was exacting. The timeline unforgiving. The obligation personal. He called Alexandra again. This time she answered. "Yes," she said. "We can still fix this," he said quickly. "There are options. We don't have to let it escalate." Alexandra listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she responded calmly. "The agreement exists so that personal conversations don't override protections," she said. "I won't interfere with it. You're letting them ruin me." David said, the edge in his voice finally breaking through. "I'm letting the process run," Alexandra replied. "Those aren't the same thing." She ended the call. The next week unfolded with procedural inevitability. Lenders issued formal inquiries. The buyer's counsel filed notice of intent. David's personal accounts were restricted pending disclosure. Advisors he had relied on stopped returning messages or began billing by the hour. Each step followed the last without pause. Alexandra remained present but distant. She attended meetings. She signed what needed to be signed. She delegated where appropriate. She did not involve herself in David's unraveling. She understood that distance was not cruelty. It was clarity. One afternoon, David appeared unannounced at her office. He looked exhausted, stripped of the confidence that once insulated him. He asked to talk. Alexandra agreed to 10 minutes. He spoke about regret, about misunderstanding, about how he never imagined it would end this way. He asked if she could speak to Margaret, suggest a pause, an adjustment. Alexandra waited until he finished. "I don't control the agreement," she said quietly. "I respected it." "There's a difference." David searched for something to argue with, an opening, a weakness. There was none. When he left, Alexandra closed the door and returned to her desk. The company's systems stabilized quickly once uncertainty was removed. Vendors adjusted, staff refocused. The absence of narrative noise allowed operations to breathe. By the end of the month, the buyback process was well underway. Funds were earmarked. Shares were reassigned according to the agreement. David's exposure became public knowledge among those who needed to know. No one celebrated. Alexandra did not feel vindicated. She felt resolved. The structure had done what it was designed to do. It had protected the company from instability, even when that instability wore a familiar face. David's story, once dominant, had become procedural. And procedures once initiated did not care how confident someone had been before they began. The formal notices began to arrive in sequence, not all at once. They were precise, unemotional documents, letters that did not raise their voices because they did not need to. Each one referenced the same clauses, the same dates, the same attachments. Each one assumed compliance, not debate. David received them at different hours of the day from different senders, each confirming what the last had already established. The transfer agent acknowledged the unauthorized sale and confirmed the hold. Lender compliance issued a notice of covenant breach and requested immediate remediation plans. The buyer's counsel delivered a measured statement reserving rights. The cumulative effect was not panic. It was erosion. David tried to respond strategically. He drafted emails that framed the issue as a misunderstanding, as a timing problem, as a family matter that should not have entered corporate channels. He sent some of them. Most went unanswered. A few were replied to with a single sentence: "Please coordinate through counsel." That phrase appeared so often, it began to feel like a boundary he could not cross. Alexandra did not receive copies of most of these exchanges. She did not need them. Margaret Lewis forwarded only what was relevant with short annotations that focused on implications rather than drama. "The lender will accelerate if the cure period lapses," one message read. "The buyer is positioning for indemnification," another noted. Alexandra acknowledged each with a brief reply. "Understood. Proceed. Noted." Her days became structured around continuity. She met with teams whose work depended on predictability. She clarified timelines. She answered questions without oversharing. She resisted the temptation to reassure with promises she did not control. "Here is what we know," she said often. "Here is what is scheduled. We'll update when there's more." People adjusted. They always did. David's world, by contrast, narrowed. Advisors he had relied on for years began to speak differently. Their language grew careful, their availability conditional. Conversations that once felt collaborative now carried disclaimers. He was asked to disclose, to document, to certify. The burden of proof shifted to him, and he felt it acutely. He reviewed the buyback calculation again late one night, hoping he had misread something. He had not. The formula was unforgiving by design. It absorbed liquidity, redistributed control, and assigned costs without regard for intent. He called Dylan once more. The call went to voicemail. He did not leave a message. At home, the distance between him and Alexandra became formal rather than emotional. They spoke about logistics only: schedules, deliveries, shared obligations. There were no arguments, no raised voices. The absence of conflict was more disorienting than anger would have been. One evening, David asked if they could talk not about the process, but about them. Alexandra considered the request and declined. "There's nothing to clarify," she said gently. "The documents are clear." He wanted to protest, to argue that marriage should have meant something more than paperwork. He wanted to ask why she hadn't stopped him sooner, why she hadn't warned him. He said none of it. He understood finally that she had not been silent because she was powerless. She had been silent because she was prepared. The emergency mediation was scheduled for the following week. It was not a courtroom. There were no raised platforms or spectators. The room was neutral glass walls, soft lighting a table designed to discourage confrontation. The mediator introduced herself and outlined the process. Alexandra attended with Margaret. David attended with new counsel, someone he had hired hastily, still catching up. The mediator asked each side to summarize their position. David spoke first. He described intent, context, marital partnership. He emphasized that harm had not been his goal. He suggested alternative resolutions, adjustments, delays. Alexandra did not respond directly. Margaret spoke next. She referenced the agreement, the unauthorized transfer, the completed transaction, the activated clause. She outlined the remedies and the timeline. She did not raise her voice. The mediator listened and nodded. After a pause, she turned to David. "Do you dispute the transfer occurred without consent?" David hesitated. His counsel shifted beside him. "No," David said quietly. "And do you dispute that the agreement specifies the consequence?" the mediator asked. "No," he said again. The mediator closed her notebook. "Then the question is not whether the process applies," she said. "It's whether you intend to comply voluntarily or require enforcement." The room went still. David looked at Alexandra. For the first time since the email, he seemed to see her clearly, not as an obstacle, not as a partner, but as someone who had chosen structure over confrontation and allowed it to speak for her. "I'll comply," he said. The words landed heavily, not as defeat, but as recognition. The mediation concluded without ceremony. There were no handshakes, no apologies, just signatures and acknowledgments. Outside, David lingered. Alexandra paused beside him, waiting for Margaret to finish a call. "I didn't think it would end like this," he said quietly. Alexandra looked at him not unkindly. "It didn't end," she said. "It resolved." She left before he could respond. The enforcement phase moved quickly after that. Funds were allocated according to the agreement. Shares were reassigned, notices were filed. Each step reduced David's exposure, but did not eliminate it. The consequences would unfold over months, not days. Alexandra filed for divorce through counsel the following morning. The paperwork was brief, the terms straightforward. She requested no commentary. She did not seek advantage beyond clarity. When David received the filing, he felt the finality settle fully for the first time. Not because the marriage was ending, but because the ambiguity had. The company stabilized further as uncertainty receded. The board confirmed governance. Lenders lifted temporary holds once conditions were met. Vendors resumed normal terms. Alexandra moved through these changes with the same quiet attention she had always applied. She documented. She delegated. She trusted the structure. On a Friday afternoon, weeks after the initial email, she cleared her desk. Not because she was leaving the company, but because she was changing how she occupied the space. She removed personal items. She reorganized files. She prepared for what came next. David watched from a distance as the world he had once dominated adjusted without him. His role diminished not through humiliation, but through irrelevance. Decisions no longer routed through him. Authority no longer deferred. He understood now what he had missed from the beginning, that power did not reside in voice or confidence, but in consent and record. That silence could be strategic. That preparation outlasted charm. Alexandra left the office that evening, as she always did, without announcement, without performance. The building emptied around her. The process was still unfolding. Consequences remained. But the turning point had passed. What followed would be administration, not conflict. And administration, Alexandra knew, was where the truth always finished its work. Administration has a rhythm. It advances not by force, but by repetition. Once the mediation concluded, the remaining steps unfolded with a predictability that would have felt comforting under different circumstances. Deadlines appeared. Forms circulated. Confirmations followed acknowledgments. Each action referenced the last building a chain that required no interpretation, only compliance. Alexandra moved through this phase without haste. She met with Margaret early on Monday morning to review the enforcement calendar. They discussed nothing speculative. There were no what-ifs, no emotional detours. The conversation focused on filings, escrow releases, lender confirmations, and the timing of share reassignment. Margaret spoke in clauses and dates. Alexandra listened and asked questions only when sequence mattered. David's name appeared frequently in the documents, but Alexandra did not say it aloud. The first funds were transferred into escrow by midweek. The amounts were precise to the cent, calculated according to the agreement's formula. Fees were assessed automatically. Interest began accruing where specified. The numbers were not punitive, they were simply thorough. David experienced this phase as a narrowing corridor. His new counsel advised him, carefully outlining options that were more theoretical than practical. Appeal pathways existed, but they required grounds he did not have. Discretion could be requested, but it would have to be granted by people bound to the same documents he had violated. He signed where instructed. At home, Alexandra and David existed in parallel routines. They spoke only when necessary. Their conversations were logistical, stripped of tone. The house felt quieter, not because of tension, but because there was nothing left to argue about. One evening, David asked if she planned to attend the next board meeting. "Yes," Alexandra said. "Will you?" He stopped, unsure how to finish the question. She waited. "Will you say anything about me?" he asked finally. Alexandra considered the question. "I'll answer what I'm asked," she said. "Nothing more." David nodded. It was the answer he had come to expect. The board meeting itself was brief. Governance items were addressed. Lender confirmations were noted. The chair thanked Alexandra for her steadiness during the transition. No one mentioned David's name. The omission was neither kind nor cruel. It was procedural. Afterward, Marcus approached Alexandra privately. "I wanted to say," he began, then paused. "The way you handled this, it mattered." Alexandra acknowledged him with a nod. She did not accept praise. She understood that institutions rewarded outcomes, not intentions. By the end of the month, the buyback was complete. Shares were reassigned according to the agreement. The cap table reflected the new reality. Control consolidated where it had always been meant to reside. The buyer withdrew its claims after reaching a separate settlement with David. The details were confidential, but the effect was visible. David's remaining liquidity tightened further. His advisors spoke more often about restructuring than recovery. Alexandra did not follow these developments closely. She had learned that distance was a form of care, not for David, but for herself. The divorce proceeded quietly. There were no disputes over assets that mattered. The settlement reflected what had already been established by the agreement and the enforcement actions. Alexandra did not seek advantage. She sought closure. When the final papers were signed, she felt no release, no triumph. The sensation was closer to alignment and the relief of a structure returning to its intended shape. David did not attend the signing in person. His counsel did. Alexandra signed, thanked them, and left without comment. The following weeks were marked by small practical changes. Alexandra moved into a new apartment closer to the office. She donated furniture she did not need. She revised routines. She slept better than she had in months, not because the conflict was over, but because ambiguity was. At work, she shifted her focus outward. She met with teams about long-term planning, about systems that would reduce dependency on any single individual. She emphasized documentation, redundancy, clarity. "We don't build around personalities," she said during one meeting. "We build around processes." People listened. David's presence at the company diminished until it disappeared entirely. His departure was handled without announcement. An internal note thanked him for past contributions and confirmed leadership continuity. It was brief. It was final. Alexandra read it once and moved on. One afternoon, she received a forwarded message from Margaret. It was a courtesy update David had filed for personal restructuring. The notice was expected. No action was required from Alexandra. She closed the message without replying. That evening, Alexandra walked home through the city, observing the ordinary motion around her. People moved with purpose, unaware of the legal sequences that had recently concluded just blocks away. The world did not pause for private reckonings. She understood now why her father had insisted on paper. Not because he distrusted people, but because he trusted systems to outlast emotion. He had known that clarity, once established, protected not only assets, but dignity. Alexandra carried that understanding with her. Weeks later, at a small dinner with colleagues, someone asked how she had managed to stay so calm through everything. Alexandra thought for a moment before answering. "I didn't stay calm," she said. "I stayed precise." The distinction mattered. As the year closed, the company released its annual report. The numbers were strong. The language was measured. There was no reference to the events that had reshaped its governance. History, Alexandra knew, often recorded outcomes, without detailing the procedures that made them possible. She was comfortable with that. David's story continued elsewhere through channels Alexandra no longer monitored. He was not ruined overnight. Consequences rarely worked that way. They accumulated quietly in the same manner he had once mistaken for permission. Alexandra did not wish him harm. She did not wish him redemption either. She accepted the distance as necessary and final. On a cold morning in December, she stood in her new office before the day began reviewing a document that outlined future safeguards. She added a note in the margin, then signed and dated it. Preparation, she had learned, was not pessimism. It was respect for time, for process, for the truth that emerged when both were allowed to do their work. The story was nearly finished. What remained was not conflict, but continuation. The consequences did not announce themselves all at once. They arrived in intervals measured and procedural, like reminders that structure once set in motion rarely reversed course. David's personal restructuring became public knowledge in limited circles, first lenders' advisors, a few former partners who understood what the filings implied. The language was cautious. The impact was not. Credit tightened. Opportunities evaporated. Conversations that once opened easily now required explanations he could not shorten. He stopped calling Alexandra, not because he had found peace, but because he had exhausted the avenues where conversation might change something. The system he had underestimated was not interested in persuasion. It responded only to compliance. Alexandra learned of these developments indirectly, if at all. She did not track David's decline. She focused on what remained her responsibility. At the company, the transition settled into its final shape. New governance protocols were formalized. Reporting lines clarified. The board approved revisions that strengthened oversight and reduced concentration of authority. Alexandra led the discussions without asserting dominance, framing each change as a return to fundamentals rather than a reaction to crisis. "This isn't about what happened," she said during one meeting. "It's about what we expect going forward." The tone mattered. It allowed the organization to move past speculation and into stability. Employees adjusted quickly. They always did when uncertainty lifted. Productivity improved. Projects regained momentum. The absence of internal tension created space for focus. Alexandra watched it happen with a mixture of relief and resolve. She did not seek recognition for it. One afternoon, Margaret Lewis stopped by Alexandra's office unannounced. It was unusual. Margaret did not interrupt, unless something required immediate attention. "I wanted to close the loop on one remaining item," she said, handing Alexandra a slim folder. It's procedural. No action required from you. Alexandra opened it. Inside was confirmation that the final enforcement step tied to the buyback had been completed. All obligations satisfied, all notices filed. This is the last of it, Margaret said. Alexandra nodded. She did not smile. Closure, she had learned, was quieter than people expected. After Margaret left, Alexandra sat for a moment without moving. The office was still. The hum of system servers' lights, distant conversations, continued uninterrupted. It struck her that this was what resolution felt like, not an ending, but a return to equilibrium. David experienced the same moment differently. He received confirmation of his compliance obligations late that evening after most offices had closed. The email was brief, the tone neutral. It confirmed what he already knew: the matter was concluded. He stared at the screen for a long time. There was no appeal left to file, no misunderstanding to correct. The record was complete. The consequences, while ongoing, were now fixed in shape. He thought of the early days of confidence, mistaken for capacity of silence, mistaken for assent. He understood now that the agreement had not been a trap. It had been a boundary he chose to cross without looking down. Alexandra, meanwhile, made a decision she had been postponing. She requested a leave of absence, not from exhaustion, but from completion. The request was approved without hesitation. She planned to travel briefly, to step away from systems she had stabilized long enough to remember what space felt like. She packed lightly. The trip was not restorative in the dramatic sense. There were no revelations. She walked unfamiliar streets, sat in quiet cafes, and read documents that had nothing to do with governance or enforcement. She slept well. She thought less. When she returned, the office felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The distance had clarified something she had not articulated before, that her strength had never been reactive. It had always been structural. She resumed work without ceremony. David attempted to rebuild in smaller ways. He consulted on projects that did not require trust he no longer commanded. He adjusted to limits that once would have felt intolerable. The process humbled him, not through humiliation, but through narrowing. He heard of Alexandra's success occasionally through channels he no longer belonged to. The stories were unremarkable. Stability restored, growth sustained. No mention of the conflict that had preceded it. That omission stung more than criticism would have. Months later, Alexandra encountered someone who had known them both during the early days of the company. The conversation drifted, as such conversations did, toward reflection. "I always thought you were quiet," the person said, not unkindly. "I didn't realize how much you were holding together." Alexandra considered the comment. "Quiet doesn't mean absent," she said. "It means deliberate." The distinction mattered to her now more than ever. As the year turned, the company entered a new phase. Plans were approved, investments allocated. The future resumed its ordinary uncertainty, healthy, unspectacular. Alexandra found satisfaction in that. David's story continued elsewhere, shaped by constraints rather than ambition. He did not disappear. He recalibrated. Consequences had a way of doing that, not erasing people, but repositioning them. Alexandra did not follow the details. She did not need to. One evening, she reviewed a draft agreement for a new initiative. She paused at a familiar section: transfer restrictions, consent requirements, remedies clearly defined. She smiled faintly, not at the memory, but at the continuity. She added a comment in the margin: "Clarity protects everyone." The agreement would be signed the following week. The arc of the story had reached its natural conclusion, not in spectacle, but in alignment. The buyback clause had done its work. The records had spoken. The system had corrected itself. Alexandra closed the file and turned off the light in her office. There were no words left to say. The final proceedings did not resemble an ending. They resembled confirmation. A mediation follow-up was scheduled not to reopen disputes, but to close administrative gaps that remained after enforcement. It took place in a neutral office, downtown, glass walls, muted carpet, a long table with no assigned seating. The room had been designed to discourage drama. It succeeded. Alexandra arrived with Margaret Lewis and took a seat near the window. She placed her phone face down on the table and folded her hands. She had nothing to present. Everything that mattered had already been filed. David arrived moments later with his counsel. He looked thinner, not from illness, but from recalibration. The confidence that once filled rooms now occupied him cautiously, as if he were learning how to carry it again without excess. The mediator opened with a summary. She listed what had been completed and what remained: confirmations of compliance, acknowledgments of receipt, final releases to be signed. Her voice was even. Her notes were thorough. No one interrupted. Margaret confirmed the sequence. David's counsel acknowledged it. The mediator checked each item off her list. When she reached the final release, she paused and looked up. "This will conclude the matter," she said. "Once signed, there will be no further claims related to the transfer." David glanced at Alexandra, then back at the document. He hesitated not from uncertainty, but from the weight of finality. He signed. Alexandra signed next. Her hand did not shake. She did not look up. The mediator closed her folder. "That concludes today's session," she said. "Thank you for your cooperation." There were no closing statements, no apologies, no speeches. Outside the room, David stopped as Alexandra gathered her coat. He cleared his throat. "I didn't think you would let it go this far," he said quietly. Alexandra turned to him. Her expression was neither guarded nor open. It was neutral in the way neutrality could be when it had been earned. "I didn't let it go anywhere," she replied. "I let it proceed." David nodded. He had no response prepared for that. They parted without ceremony. The following week, Alexandra attended the board meeting that formally acknowledged the completion of the process. The chair thanked council, compliance, and finance for their diligence. He thanked Alexandra last, for respecting the structure, he said, and for maintaining stability throughout. Alexandra inclined her head. She did not speak. The board voted to adopt a revised governance charter that codified several of the practices Alexandra had already been following: clear consent pathways, redundant oversight, mandatory documentation thresholds. The vote was unanimous. David's name did not appear anywhere in the materials. Alexandra felt no satisfaction in that absence. She understood it as alignment. Systems, when functioning correctly, did not need to remember disruptions once they had corrected them. That afternoon, she met with a small group of managers to discuss the next quarter's objectives. The conversation was practical. Timelines were set. Resources allocated. The work resumed its ordinary cadence. After the meeting, she returned to her office and closed the door. She sat for a moment without moving. There was a quietness to the space that had not been there before, not emptiness, but completion. The tension that had once threaded through her days had dissolved into something steadier. She thought briefly of her father, of the way he had insisted on clarity without explaining why. She understood it now in a way she had not before. Protection, he had known, did not need to be loud to be effective. David experienced the same week differently. He returned to a smaller office, one that reflected the recalibration of his circumstances. He met with advisors who spoke in cautious terms. He reviewed plans that emphasized containment rather than growth. The future he now imagined was narrower but more honest. He did not resent Alexandra. Resentment required the belief that something had been taken unfairly. What he felt instead was recognition and the delayed understanding that he had crossed a line he never bothered to see. He drafted a message to Alexandra, once then deleted it. There was nothing to ask for. There was nothing to explain. The distance between them settled into permanence without hostility. Alexandra finalized the last internal memo related to the transition and sent it to the board. It confirmed that all compliance steps had been completed and that no further action was required. She closed the file, archived it, and marked it complete. That evening, she left the office earlier than usual. She walked without destination, letting the city move around her. The noise felt different now, less intrusive, more ambient. She passed storefronts and office windows, lit from within, each containing its own small universe of decisions and consequences. At a quiet intersection, she stopped and checked her phone. There were no new messages. Nothing required her attention. She felt for the first time in months unassigned. The next morning, Alexandra submitted her resignation from the board committee she had joined during the crisis. The note was brief. She cited completion of purpose and confidence in the structures now in place. The chair responded within the hour, thanking her and expressing respect. She did not leave the company. She simply stepped back into a role that allowed her to observe without carrying the weight of enforcement. David heard of her decision later through an intermediary. He understood it immediately. Completion invited departure, not attachment. In the weeks that followed, Alexandra focused on work that felt constructive rather than corrective. She mentored quietly. She reviewed proposals with an eye toward sustainability rather than speed. She asked fewer questions, but the right ones. No one spoke about the past unless necessary. When it was mentioned, it was in terms of lessons rather than blame. Alexandra preferred it that way. One afternoon, she found herself reviewing an old email from years earlier, the one that had first attached the shareholder agreement. The language was formal, the tone careful, the foresight unmistakable. She closed it without nostalgia. The matter had ended as it began on paper in sequence without spectacle. Alexandra left the office that day, with the sense that something essential had been preserved, not just a company, not just assets, but a principle. That clarity, when respected, prevented harm more effectively than confrontation ever could. David's chapter had closed without public reckoning. Alexandra's had resolved without triumph. The structure had done what it was meant to do. The ending did not arrive as a moment. It arrived as a condition. By the time the final filings were archived and the last acknowledgments logged, the story had already settled into its aftermath. There were no headlines, no whispered rumors with sharp edges. The company moved forward with the unremarkable steadiness that only followed when uncertainty had been fully removed. Alexandra Walker returned to a rhythm that felt familiar, but altered. Her days were quieter now, not because responsibility had diminished, but because it had clarified. She no longer carried the unspoken burden of watching for collapse. The systems were in place. The boundaries were reinforced. What remained was work, and work was something she understood. She spent more time reviewing long-term strategies, less time correcting behavior. Meetings felt shorter. Decisions arrived cleaner. The organization no longer leaned on her silence to absorb risk. It leaned on structure. That difference mattered. David's absence became permanent without being announced. His name faded from calendars, then from conversations. New hires never heard it. Older employees stopped referencing him unless prompted, and even then, only in passing. History, Alexandra knew, did not erase people, it compressed them. She did not feel satisfaction in that compression. If anything, she felt distance. David's life reassembled itself elsewhere, along smaller margins. He found work that required expertise, but not authority participation, but not trust. He adjusted slowly, learning the contours of limitation in the way people did when excess was no longer available to buffer mistakes. Occasionally, he thought of Alexandra, not with anger, not even with regret, but with a recognition that had arrived too late. He understood now that what he had mistaken for silence had been discipline, that what he had dismissed as formality had been foresight. He did not reach out again. Alexandra filed the last personal document related to the divorce one morning before work. It was routine final administrative. She signed, dated, scanned, and archived it like everything else. Then she closed the folder. The act felt complete in a way few things ever did. In the weeks that followed, Alexandra made small changes to her life, none of them dramatic. She adjusted her schedule. She began leaving the office earlier on certain days. She spent time in places that required nothing from her except presence. She did not tell anyone she was doing this on purpose. She did not need to. One evening, she sat alone in her apartment, reviewing a draft agreement for a new venture the company was considering. The language was careful, the clauses familiar. She read slowly, pausing where consent requirements were outlined, where remedies were defined without threat. She made a single revision, tightening language that could be misread, clarifying sequence, where ambiguity might invite assumption. When she finished, she signed and sent it on. Preparation, she had learned, was not a reaction. It was a posture. At a small internal gathering marking the close of the fiscal year, the CEO thanked several people for their contributions. Alexandra's name was mentioned once briefly in the context of stability and foresight. She nodded. She did not speak. Afterward, a junior colleague approached her hesitantly. "I hope you don't mind me asking," the colleague said. "How did you know what to do when everything started to go wrong?" Alexandra considered the question carefully. "I didn't wait for it to go wrong," she said. "I read." The answer seemed to satisfy the questioner, though Alexandra suspected it would take years to fully understand. Later that night, she walked home through streets softened by distance and time. The city felt unchanged, indifferent to private reckonings. Cars passed. Windows glowed. People moved forward without knowing what had nearly unraveled behind corporate facades and polite smiles. She felt no need to explain any of it. Alexandra understood now that justice, when done quietly, rarely looked like vindication. It looked like continuity, like harm prevented rather than punished, like a system doing what it had been designed to do before anyone noticed it was needed. That was enough. The story that began with betrayal ended without spectacle. No one was humiliated in return. No voice was raised to reclaim dignity. Alexandra did not win by speaking louder. She won by refusing to speak when speech would have diluted precision. She left nothing behind that needed defending. On a cold morning, not long after Alexandra arrived at the office early, and stood for a moment before turning on the lights, she looked out over the city, watching it wake, and felt something rare and unforced settle in her chest. Peace, not the fragile kind that depended on circumstances, but the durable kind that followed alignment. She turned on the lights and began her day. The buyback clause had bankrupted David, not because it was cruel, but because it was exact. Because it existed to correct imbalance, not to assign blame. Because it required no emotion to execute its function. Alexandra Walker walked away from the entire ordeal without triumph, without apology, and without needing to be seen. She left with her dignity intact. And that, in the end, was the only outcome that mattered. Some stories end with confrontation. Others end with silence that lasts. This was a story about preparation over reaction, about paper over performance, about how power shifts not in the moment of betrayal, but in the months and years before it, when someone chooses to read instead of assume. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on where you're watching from and what time it is there. Different places, same lessons. If you believe quiet strength and legal justice deserve more space, you're welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of obligation, but alignment. Thank you for staying until the end.